Now, another week and a new poll this time. The front page of the Telegraph was dominated by this. I don't know if you saw the Telegraph today. Had a picture of Rishi Sunak as well, looking not that happy, I've got to say. Now, this latest poll is a YouGov survey, and the headline of which was basically saying that the Tories are on a par. Basically, they're going to get wiped out a la 1997. Now, before we get into the whys and the wherefores of this, many of my viewers perhaps might not be as familiar with 1997 as your good self. Just give a brief overview of what happened, if you would, back then, Richard.
Well, in 1992, the Conservatives won a narrow majority after the polls were suggesting, until quite late in the election campaign, that Labour would win. So it was a surprise win. And then the Conservatives were in government for 5 years. And over the course of that parliament, they lost by-elections like this government. And so by the time that there was the 97 election between John Major for the Conservatives and Tony Blair for Labour, the government didn't have a majority. And then Labour, which was polling very, very well in the polls, sometimes over 20-point lead over the government, actually underperformed on polling day, got about a 12-point lead, but that was enough to deliver a historic Labour victory and for the government to win 165 seats, which was a historic low for the Conservatives. So that's when people talk about a 1997-style election, that's the kind of election that they're talking about.
So I'm going to come back to you on this synopsis for today. But before I do, Alex, you are a very keen Tory. You support your party well. When you see that headline, Tories facing 1997-style wipeout, do you agree with that?
The polls have been sustained in what they've been indicating for some time, and one can be a sceptic about polling generally or specific polls in particular, but if you get this kind of sustained results, it's plainly the public saying something to the party concerned. But the truth about polls is, of course, they tell you how people think they would vote now, and the election isn't now. The election is at a future time, and things can change. Just to put meat on those bones, you know, people being polled about how they would vote in Scotland a mere few months ago, before the unbelievable collapse of the SNP, would have given you a completely different set of results to what we may see from the public come polling day in the UK. Now, that is not to say the government can be complacent and say, well, something will come along, let's just carry on and things will change. They've got to work harder than they ever have, but that is worth bearing in mind. The other thing I just mentioned is this. In 1997, John Major had no majority at all. Now, whatever you think of the government, they have a pretty chunky majority. It's a much bigger hill for the Labour Party to climb.
I think as well I can get this graph up, because there was a nice graph in the Telegraph that I can put on screen whilst we're talking to you that shows the difference between the achievement of the 2019 election versus the current projection based on this poll for 2024. What do you make to this poll? Do you regard it as accurate? What's your thoughts on it, Richard?
Polling is more of an art than a science in some ways. This particular poll has a lot to credit it. It's a very large sample, 14,000 people. It uses a method called multi-level regression and post-stratification, MRP. And what that basically means is that it tries to use demographic data, age and occupation and so on, based on individual level responses to try to project out to how different constituencies would vote in an election based on the population makeup of a different constituency. These type of polls have been shown to be quite accurate relative to actual election results, both in this country and in other countries like Australia. So although Alex is right that a poll is not predictive, it's a snapshot of where we are right now, this is probably the clearest snapshot that we've had in some time of where the electorate is.
But there'll be many of my viewers, right, who say, well, do you know what, these polls are fascinating, but I've never been polled for anything in all of my life. So, you know, is this stuff kind of worth the paper that it's written on? Is it biased? All the rest of it?
Back in the day, pollsters used to use an approach called random digit dialing, which is that any landline telephone in the country would have an equal probability of being rung up. And at a time when there might have been fairly universal ownership of landline telephones, you basically had almost an equal chance of getting people. Now, even in that scenario, people who were not at home at certain times of the day might be missed out, and pollsters might have to re-wait for that. But these days, when people don't have landline telephones, people don't answer their phone if there's an unknown number calling them anymore, pollsters use the internet more. And so YouGov uses a panel where people actually opt in and say, yes, I would like to be surveyed. So one of the reasons people might not have been surveyed is they've not opted into this panel. You might say, well, that's biased then because it's only people who've opted in. Well, what then YouGov tries to do is try to use the sort of census data that we have about the country, the age, racial, religious makeup of the country, to then try and weight people's responses accordingly. So it's not perfect, but in absence of a period of time where people all had phones and everyone was answering their phone, this is the best approximation we can get to.
So when you look at this, and this is not a great... I mean, that picture, I'll get it up again on the screen for you. I mean, it is disastrous for the Tories, I've got to say. It was pretty much all blue. I'm summarising for anyone that's listening. It was pretty much all blue, and now it's not. That is the short version. How do the Tories turn this around? Well,
before we go further on turnaround, it's probably even worse in terms of challenges than that, because these the point about snapshots is government might reassure itself things could change, but they could also get worse, of course. And if, and I'm conscious I speak on GB News as I do this, if Nigel Farage returned to frontline politics, I think that we would be likely see a fringe party pick up in the polls beyond what you're seeing on these numbers. And whilst, of course, there are people who waver between voting Labour and Reform, or Labour and that kind of party, the government will think to itself, we are more likely to lose votes on the right to an organisation led by Nigel Farage. So there are things that could point to greater challenges for the government. You will recall the Prime Minister set himself 5 pledges, and I think that trying to deliver on those 5 is a sensible pursuit for government, not least because they spent so much time telling us about those 5 pledges. But in reality, there is one outsized one that matters, and it is stopping the boats. If this government doesn't deliver meaningfully on its migration pledge, then it will face this kind of result.
Which they're not at the moment.
I mean, look, the part of the challenge for the government is they haven't got there yet. But again, like polling, this is a snapshot of where people are now, and the point on migration is that's where government is now. It may not reflect the reality by the time we go to the polls.
And what I find interesting as well is there'll be a great number of people, Richard, that are just not going to vote. That they are so disillusioned, they're so fed up with everyone, quite frankly. They think there are lots of them, just a bunch of, well, I can't say the words because it's tea time, but you get my point. They're not really represented anywhere.
Well, and there's an interesting parallel with 1997. In 1992, John Major won the most votes of any leader for the premiership of all time. And so when Blair won that huge Labour landslide in 1997, he actually won fewer votes overall than John Major had won, because a lot of the Tory voters in the country had just dropped out and didn't show up in the polls. And that's less damaging to the Tories than them voting Labour, but if they're not showing up, that's still pretty bad news for the government.
See, that in parallel is fascinating, because that is being reflected at the moment in the much larger group of people who are saying not going to vote to pollsters than in the past. And don't knows and don't votes are wildly disproportionately drawn from people who voted Tory in 2019, many of whom were loaning their votes to the government and Boris Johnson and Brexit and so forth. But that means that the challenge for the government is very hard, but at least identifiable. It's winning back people who voted for them last time. It's not like it's an enormous challenge it's so opaque and you can't work out what it is. It's winning back your own vote.
You see, you say it's your own vote, but actually one of the reasons that the Tories did so well is because people lent them a vote. So it wasn't the Tory vote, it was like a lending of someone that either wasn't engaged previously or was engaged elsewhere. And
so that's the other thing that's quite clear, right? The last election was BBC, Boris, Brexit and Corbyn, and none of those factors, broadly speaking, are going to apply this time. And that means you have to find a new song to sing, you have to find a new message, and that's why the Prime Minister has sought to position the Conservative Party as a party of change, which is very difficult after you've been in government for this long. Well,